So welcome to this second session on history and the value of the study of history in critical thinking, whether it be in our individual lives where we look back on events in our lives and what we remember, whether we keep a journal to help us see the big picture of what's happening in our lives, or whether we ask others about what's happened in their lives and we learn from the stories that others tell us about the life journey, or whether we look at the bigger events in history. This raises the question as to what are the most significant events in history, whether it be politics, whether it be economics, whether it be businesses, whether it be technologies and innovations. I think because we are teachers, we would say that education is very important in any person's life, and certainly in our experience, we've found that primary and secondary and tertiary studies makes a huge difference in people's lives, in their life history, and that's why we contribute. Can I just ask Noah at the beginning, out of politics, economics, business, technology, education, family, what are the big events, do you think, in history, Noah?
Well, obviously, you have the world wars and the great wars, just wars in general. I also think some other things in history is technological advances or medical advances, so such as the discovery of penicillin or Marie Curie, where we found out that radium will kill a person. So that was fun. Not for her, but and then yes, and then technological studies. So the birth of the internet, the birth of the phone, obviously the wheel, if we're going way back. But then that begs the question, if the wheel wasn't invented then, would someone have come up with it later because of its necessity to society now? And then it's like, well, is Wi-Fi and the internet something that we need, or is it something that we've learnt to need and now can't survive without, because we've essentially spun this web of society around the internet? Whereas for the wheel, as an example, they integrated that into their society and put that invention, and the phone, they put that into their society, where we've kind of structured our society around inventions now. And I think that's an interesting concept, because it's like, well, does that mean that we can have advances in the next great things in history besides wars without having the internet and technology and all of these things? Can we go back to having some kind of like an economic change, or does that change only come with wars? Say, for example, with the whole Russia-Ukraine situation, that's just boosted our petrol prices right up. We're not even there, but that's still how it affects us. But does that mean then that it's only kind of the big events that now cause a ripple in the lake that is our lives? Or is it anything that can kind of change us up or shake us up or provide a little bit of difference or bring about ease? Just like I have calculator, computer, camera, and like everything just on this little device on my phone and in front of me. Like I can see all of you guys from the comfort of my bedroom. Does that?
Yeah. They're great points. Building on that, we've got Jared Diamond that wrote a history book which he called Guns, Germs and Steel. And in this book, he argued that these are the three big things that have shaped the world. Guns, and when they invented the capacity to put gunpowder into a handheld gun, that changed the world. And if you go back before that, you've got the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So the invention of metallurgy. And then you've got germs. And so often big events in the world are affected by the spread of disease. And then steel, when you move from iron to more advanced levels of steel, you can develop the motor car and internal combustion engine. And so that's one view of history. Another view of history that Jared Diamond wrote is collapse, in which he describes about 20 or so societies that have collapsed. In this book on collapse, he describes the person who may have cut down the last tree on Easter Island. And Easter Island, therefore, doesn't have trees, whereas in Japan, you have the opposite. They realized they were chopping down trees in the 1700s or so, and then they banned the chopping down of trees. So Japan now has lots of trees. And so the idea is that societies can collapse. But Jared Diamond also says he's an optimist. He says that while never before have we been at a place where great disasters can occur due to atomic energy and all of the other things, we've never had such a high population, moving from 1 billion people to 7 billion or so. He also says never before have we had the technology that can help overcome these difficulties. And so there's an optimistic line in his book on collapse where he describes the collapse of maybe 20 civilizations. He also speaks about the possibility that we could use technology, and we're doing that with electric cars at the moment. And so these are very good thoughts that you make there, Noah. And so the values and tasks of historical study inevitably involve recording what has happened and seeking to understand these big events in our lives and in the world around us that change the world. And so the concept of history plays a fundamental role in human thought. It invokes notions of human agency, that is, leaders and people can bring change to the world. It also invokes the notion of material circumstance, that is, people can be limited by the events that are around. It raises the possibility that we can learn from history and suggests that we can better understand ourselves, better understand the present world, by understanding the forces, choices, and circumstance that bring about the situations that we see. Before the break, I noticed as well that when we talk about great men, we could also talk about Christianity, and we can also talk about schools. So do you think if you're writing a history of Christians through Martin Luther, Calvin, or even in the last 30, 40, 50 years, your churches, would you focus on the great men and why? Or would you focus on lots and lots of ordinary people? And similarly with schools, would you focus on the great leaders in schools or ordinary people? Any thoughts?
Going off what I was saying before, and I've just had a new thought with it. There's no point focusing on the big leader if you don't recognize that they needed the people underneath them to actually make them be able to do what they do. I feel like that's the key. Recognize that nobody can just make a huge change just on their own. They need support, really.
And certainly the second in command next to them, and then the people below them, and go all the way down. And then it would be good to include a sample of people who are working at the coalface. And I like that idea of balance there. And similar with schools, certainly headmasters make big decisions, principals, and you've also got everyone being involved as well. And so I think there's a balance. And you face the same change in your class. That is, you can celebrate the class captain, one person, or you can celebrate everyone in your class, or you can do a combination of both. Stephanie, any thoughts in a classroom? How do you recognise everyone, but at the same time, you may also want to recognise the top of the class?
I don't really have an answer at this point.
No, sounds good. Josie, any thoughts on if you're working in a class and you want to balance that recognition of everyone, but also recognition of the ordinary students in the class? And then I might ask Madeline after that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely certain times that you should be recognizing when students are working well. I think like even if you've got lower students in your class, they should be recognized when they're doing well in class. I think it should be more of an encouragement more than a, oh my goodness, these people are doing 20 times better. It should be a if there's certain people doing something well, they should be recognized by that, but there should be also a collective overall for all your class to just recognize that they are doing well.
So
so
good.
just
Yeah.
keeping
Madeline,
that
your
balance
thoughts?
there.
Yeah, that's terrific.
I guess it just depends like what metric you're using to define as like
Mm.
the top of the class. If you're looking at academics, maybe, but when you're looking at a values-based approach, as in like, is this person applying themselves and trying their best? You have an opportunity then to celebrate every person for meeting then their personal best, which then even in that look at history, but especially then I guess in a classroom, it comes really clear like the need for recognizing individuals so that you can celebrate them based on then them meeting individualized goals, where the value of that goal is set across the class. So somebody's best and somebody else's best might look way different. And so someone might be really suitable to be a class captain because of the responsibility that that entails. And somebody else might be really suitable to do a different job in a classroom based on the way that they've improved or their strengths. So I think it's recognizing your different students and then having targets that are set on values, not on specific outcomes for me in my space, because that's what we do in USH.
So good. And so that reminds us of that balance that's needed between recognizing key people, but also recognizing everyone. And also it reminds us of the importance of a diversity of viewpoints, doesn't it? Is that you can celebrate sporting achievement, you can celebrate achievement in various subjects, and also you can celebrate improvement for doing well. And lots of things can be celebrated. John Jacob Anderson said, history is the narration of events as they happen, but we've also seen that we've got to be selective in some way. And the question is, are we selective in an unbiased way, or do we understand the reasons for our selectivity? Arnold Toynbee said, history is to be used and applied. That is, history is not just about knowing, it's about how you act in response to knowing. James Joyce wrote a novel in Dublin, Ireland, about a single day in 1904, June 16, which he called Ulysses, because it was based loosely on 2,500, 3,000 years before that, the Trojan War and Odysseus' journey back home. So it has that theme of traveling back to home, and it's said to be one of the great works in modernist literature. And he makes the statement in there, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. And so the thought is then asked, what way is history sometimes a nightmare? Any thoughts on ways in which history could be seen as a nightmare? Perhaps Ruben first. Any thoughts, Ruben, on ways history can sometimes be a nightmare, and then maybe Noah?
I'd say one, when it gets really messy, like you don't know where things have been biased and everything. And I guess number two, if it'll be a nightmare if you look back and realize, oh, we've taken such a heavily biased approach to this that we've been telling the story wrong forever when we were the bad guys, say as such, if it was a certain researcher from a particular country.
And false histories can affect our lives. That is, people can tell you you're not so good. We can tell students that you're not so good. We're telling stories all the time to our students and people around us. Noah, your thoughts on why might history sometimes be seen as a nightmare?
I think it can be seen as a nightmare because it's something that is both objective but also heavily subjective as well, because whenever you have something that involves other people and the human experience, it ceases to be as simple as black or white, good or bad, because, you know, like the bad guys are never the villains in their own stories. They're actually like the heroes. So I think that is quite a complicated mess and a bit of a nightmare, to say, because you can't simply state something like this happened and it was good, or this happened and it was bad, because statistically, and the chances are that it probably came with great loss, it came with sacrifice, it had severe ramifications, whether economically, politically, socially, personally, all of it, religiously, it all came. And so that kind of tangles a certain web that you can't look at one without seeing how it connects to the other and needing to take that into consideration. And I think that's a bit of a nightmare.
That's so good. Now, of course, Joyce's statement, history is a nightmare, could also refer to World War One. Like Plato's cave, it could refer to, often we see shadows and illusions and chains that hold us, and we need to turn around and see the brighter light as we get change and education and teaching that leads us out of the cave into realities that are out there. So in our lives and in the telling of history, there can be these narratives that are told that move towards these spaces. Now, some like Charles Austin Beard have said that history could be a science, and so we could actually predict what could happen in the future. Do you think we can foretell the future? And next, is the world getting better? Is the world getting worse? Is it more complex, that it's both worse or better? Or is it more complex still? Or does it relate to the nature of humans? That is, humans can do good and bad. So rather than humans who are good and bad, so you label them, we could think about humans doing good and bad, and humans being complex that way. So any thoughts on history? Maybe Matilda, what are let's start with Shyla. Shyla, do you think, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, this is kind of relating this question and the last one and the Irish writing thing, that idea of like history repeating itself, and like how history has shaped like both the good and there's like a lot of bad in like where we are now. And like we're seeing like people saying like, oh, wars can't really happen in this day and age, like, and like obviously there hasn't been war in Europe for a long time, but now there's like what's happening in Ukraine, and like that idea of history repeating itself, like, is it getting better, is it getting worse? And like the retelling of the Trojan War story in a different context, because like things happen like cyclical nature, kind of, I don't know if that's the right word, but like just with different like context and like a different setting or circumstance. And I feel like because of human nature and the way that we are, like often our behaviors and like our decisions and our actions and reactions towards each other in like as society or as a country or even as individuals, like are always going to be really similar. So like events that follow consequently like are similar.
Yeah, that's well said. What about someone else, or Matilda, do you have thoughts? But
yes, yeah. Hey, what was because I've only really just sat down because I just got here. But what was your questions?
Yeah, is the world getting better or worse?
Oh, worse. although I was reading in the Bible times of the New Testament, and the world was pretty crazy then. I feel like the world got a bit better as it progressed when people used the Bible as the center of like leadership and everything. Everyone was like, oh my gosh, it's working. Yeah, God's vibes are really making the world good. And now that we're moving away from the Bible, from a Christian perspective, I can see the world going back down that wormhole again. And we're starting to accept things that kind of were brought up in the Bible that, you know, Paul and stuff like that addressed. And now we're revisiting all that stuff, and we're kind of accepting those like sins and stuff like that of the Bible. And so I can see the world going from really bad, all right, and now where we are now, it's really bad again. And
that
that's
good.
kind of from what I've been like observing.
And Madeline, what are your thoughts on whether things worse, better, or more complex?
I'm going to go with more complex, because for some people, the world is a much better place now. Like, to acknowledge our own privilege and to think like, my life has small complications, but it's not that bad. And then to think that there are other people, and we can talk about the Ukrainian conflict, but even aside from major world conflict, there are people that live in poverty every day whose ancestors didn't live in poverty. So when you look at people's standard of living as a metric of is the world getting better or worse, there are some people generationally whose lives have gotten better, and some people who generationally their lives have gotten worse. I like love building on Matilda's idea of like moving towards and away from the Christian standard of what a leader is to a secular standard. That also means that when you put that lovely comparison of, you know, the Amazon employees who get a timed 5-minute toilet break, like are getting paid minimum wage so that Jeff Bezos or whatever can go on an adventure into space, is such a small representation. Because then if you're looking at that Amazon chain, like, where did their goods come from? Who's sitting in a Chinese factory manufacturing something that actually doesn't leave that space? So I don't know. I think some people's lives have gotten better and some people's lives have gotten worse. And I think probably my life has gotten better from what my expectations would have been 50 years ago or 150 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but that's not the same for other people.
Good points, and great points on comparing our modern world with points back then. So thanks, Matilda and Madeline, for that. So history is very, very important in the way it helps us understand our life journey and helps us understand what's happening more broadly. What are the tools that we use for study history? Firstly, we've got the events themselves. So we need to describe the people and events as accurately as we can. And some people will write a biography and you collect the information to put in the biography. We also need to consider the way the events and the people are seen and perceived. So there's different perspectives, different biases, different expectations that can be involved. There's benefits in considering multiple accounts, including the primary sources. So we use the word primary source to mean the original materials from back at that time. And in the New Testaments, the Gospels could be considered primary sources. They take us back to the 1st century when the events were described, sometimes 20 years after. So events of Jesus 30 AD, and we have Gospels 50, 60 AD. And so history is a record of people's past based on a critical examination of these documents and facts. And this includes also a capacity to locate these documents, understand, evaluate the sources of evidence from their past and their influence on the present. And you've even got in New Testament studies, Dead Sea Scrolls. So in 1947, some people through some rocks in a cave, heard breaking pottery, went in, discovered pieces of parchment, which are now in Jerusalem in the museum, which are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tell us about life around about 100 BC through to the time of Jesus in 50 AD, when people lived in that Dead Sea area and they preserved scrolls of the Old Testament. To be able to compare, contrast and evaluate historical evidence, we've got to think through the evidence that we have, and then we can construct a context-specific evidence-based interpretation of the evidence, whether it be New Testament, whether it be Anzac battles. Then we've got to assess different authors' positions and make decisions about the events and the ways they are described. So another side of the truth of historical interpretation is how we make interpretations and decisions. Another side of it then is the secondary analysis, where people write with their opinions about what happened, and then there is tertiary analysis of these opinions of opinions. So there's these levels of history. Why study history? Michael Crichton said that if you don't know history, then you don't know anything, because you're like a leaf that doesn't know that it's part of a tree. That is, all the ideas and the cultures that we're a part of flow out of the past. And to do this study of history, we can go back to the primary sources, which not only include the documents, letters, records, but they can also include pictures, old buildings and ruins, artifacts and objects, clothing, literature, poems, bones, archaeological remains, photographs, and films. I visited Jordan historical site once, and there was a lady there who had put a table near this historical site, and when there was no one around, she'd just dig in the sand around and find 2,000-year-old pieces of pottery or whatever, and then put them on her table. And then when a busload of tourists came through, she'd sell off these 2,000-year-old artifacts for $10 each or something like that. So I don't know whether that preserves history very well. It's just a very enterprising way in which people are gathering artifacts and objects from the past. Clothing can tell us about history. Literature and poems can tell us about history. All of these details. Bones can tell us about history as well. And then the secondary, tertiary sources are where we take the primary sources and we look over them. And then these are best when they're published in peer-reviewed research, where there are other people who look over the record and describe it in a certain way. So secondary sources and then tertiary sources, which review these further, are strongest when they're peer-reviewed academic research by professional historians. And we've also got textbooks and magazines and teachers who all give these resources. So the primary sources are the actual evidence that historians look at, and the secondary sources tend to be more evaluating the evidence. Can I get you to look at this picture and think about a camp that was held? Looking at this picture as a primary source of evidence, what could you tell us from that? So Stephanie, if you were to have this primary source of evidence and you were to prepare a report for parents on what had happened, what could you say from this piece of primary evidence?
Well, it looks like an outdoor adventure camp. And probably like the preteen to early teen age group. What have they done? I mean, I'm glad that there's safety equipment there. That's something that's good to note. So I guess risk assessments were completed. You could make the assumption. You've got information about who's running it, Tim Hortons Camp Day. You've also got the date. I don't know what else you can pull.
And that shows the way in which Stephanie now is drawing secondary descriptions from the primary evidence, which is the picture that's there. And as you say, you've got the safety equipment, helmets, and other things as well. So which is most trustworthy? You've got the original primary sources, then you've got the secondary sources, and then they're peer reviewed, but you have to decide, are the peers just working on one way of looking at things? Sometimes you get more secular people in a peer-reviewed group. Sometimes you get more evangelical people in a peer-reviewed group, more Catholic people in a peer-reviewed group. So even though it's peer-reviewed, there are professionals from particular backgrounds, and it could be from a white European background as opposed to other backgrounds. And then tertiary sources are textbooks, museums, public histories, and then the popular histories are the less reliable in some ways, because they could be solid and factual, or they could go a long way away from facts. All in all, it's the peer-reviewed process that makes for better histories when you've got other scholars who evaluate your writing. And that's one of the strengths of doing your studies in education, is that you've got lecturers who are reviewing what you do, and then you've also got other people that we interact with who review what we do as teachers and lecturers. And you've got to ask, in politics and economics, are there peer review processes? In media, are there peer reviewed processes or not? Original research is so important when people go into libraries, and you can get sponsorship to go into libraries and look at primary sources and have a fresh look at the evidence, and then you can draw up new knowledge of the past. And in biblical studies and in all historical studies, people are constantly looking at the evidence again and again. And then historiography is the description of all the historical research that is done and how it's going and how it's working. The tertiary sources are the compilation of all of the research that has been gathered. They're not so much the original research, but often you get writers who've got expertise in original research who are doing the tertiary sources. And then when it comes to dating systems, we may use AD and BC, or if Jesus is born 4 years BC, we may move to the Common Era or before the Common Era in terms of the way we look at history. And so how do we make sense of the influences in history? We can go to the primary sources, we can go to textbooks, we can go to scripture, we can look at all of these different sources. Can I get you now to write down what are 3 of the most important events in history? So if we were to think of the last 3,000 years, what are the 3 most important events of the last 3,000 years? Again, we're thinking about significance. We're now thinking about a long history, because you could also be writing about your own life journey. So that would be a shorter history. And we could also be writing about big history, which could be the history of the universe, which would be a much longer history. But if we were to talk about a long history of the last 3,000 years, can I get you to write down what are 3 most significant events of the last 3,000 years? Josie, any thoughts on what you think are the 3 most significant events of the last 3,000 years?
For me, I just wrote down Jesus's birth, death, and resurrection. That's what I had. That's the first thing that sort of came to my mind.
Yeah. That's good. And Jasmine, what are your thoughts on the 3 most significant events?
I actually had a very similar answer to Josie, and so did Tilly as well. I also think the introduction of Christianity into the Roman Empire was also an important part of history. And then it's hard to think. Like, I can't think of. I've suddenly forgotten all historical events that have occurred in the last 3,000 years. But I think certainly the trials that many people have had to go through, I reckon, have made a massive impact. Like, yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. And Shyla, thoughts yourself?
I don't really know. This is like something I haven't really thought about.
Yeah, Aidan, your thoughts?
Mine was the same as, sorry, I didn't catch who it was with the Jesus stuff.
Yeah, Tish, what are your thoughts on 3 most significant events?
Yeah, I also had Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection written down.
Yep. And Rachel?
I have nothing in mind at the moment, but to be completely honest, when you said 3,000 years history, I'm thinking about something more recently than the recent Jesus times. My first thought was like the Twin Towers.
Right.
Totally related to, but you said history, that's history. I think it's significant because I think the case hasn't been, there's hasn't been a conclusion to actually what happened. There are different stories on how the buildings collapsed and if it was planned or if it wasn't planned, but many people were killed in it. So I think people are still, figuring that out. But yeah, that's what came to my mind.
And isn't it interesting, events that lead to death of lots of people stand out in history, and we learn lessons from that because we don't want to go the same way. Tara, what are your thoughts on big events in history?
So I initially also had obviously the Jesus birth, death and resurrection, but I think for me personally, I guess in my family context, it'd be the Great Hunger in Ireland, which lasted from 1845, and then we could go, well, the World Wars as well, World War I, World War II. They'd be the three biggest, I think, for me in my context.
And certainly World War I and World War II have shaped the face of Europe, but also the world, and shaped the division between the communist countries and the free market countries and capitalism. And so they've had a huge influence on our world, and also democracy, and also with the elections that take place in democratic countries, and also individualism is an aspect of Western nations that have followed that pattern. Ruben, your thoughts on what are events that have stood out?
Yeah, I had Jesus came, World Wars, and then I recall it being a big deal, the Alexander Library fire, which was ages ago.
Yeah, so Alexander,
because so much history was lost there. So
I
think that was significant.
Yeah, so the Alexandria Library in northern Egypt. Library fire, and some other thoughts there, Madeline, your thoughts?
Yep, I had the Hiroshima bombs, so the first deployment of the atomic bombs, which fits into World War II, but just how that changed modern history. On your democracy point, I actually had the Magna Carta, where we moved power away from the royal family in England to a more democratic Western world. I also started with the Jesus stuff and then started kind of falling out from there, but also the same as that book that we looked at before, The Introduction of Steel. I was also thinking about landing on the moon. Just all those big moments that made people think reevaluate what their reality is and how it can change. Even with the move from steel to the motor car and trains were a huge, steam transit was a massive change as far as trade routes were concerned, and the ability to move resources quickly from one place to another in mass volume. Just lots of the bits and pieces, I guess. Yeah,
so good. So they're all ways in which we can look at history and look at the events that have occurred in history. So can I get everyone now to think about what are some things that have stood out to you from these two lessons today? And can I get you to write down 3 things that you've learned from the study of history today and the ways it contributes to critical thinking? So what are 3 things that you've learned from looking at history and critical thinking? What stood out? Why? And really, we're reflecting on the ways in which an understanding of events in our past, in the short term, in the longer term, in our life journey of 20 or 30 years, and also longer histories of our nation, of Western civilizations of the world over 2,000 or 3,000 years. And then the big event in history, Jesus' death and resurrection. And while you're thinking about that, it's possible that the question we asked before, where is God in history, leads to the idea that we need freedom if we are to live. And for that reason, God can't be all powerful in one sense. He's got to give us freedom, just like a teacher gives students freedom. He can't force the students to do their homework, etc. And parents give their children freedom. For that reason, history becomes complex because people can do evil and good. And so God can be there working all things for good. So Romans 8:28 tells us that God's working all things for good. Now, the Romans did a great job in history. They built roads. The Greeks did a great job in history. They gave us philosophizing. But Jesus also, when he intervened in history, prayed for people and they were healed. But perhaps the most outstanding action of Jesus in history is when he went to the cross. And so at the cross, we actually see evil, and we see the Romans, we see the religious people, and we see an innocent person dying. And so in the cross, God comes to history, and he acts in history, and he shows the way in which it can be turned around. And so I think the cross is central to the understanding of the question, where is God in history and how it works out? It reminds us of the importance of humility, the importance of love, because at the cross, God shows love. At the cross, God steps into the world and suffers with us. And so he identifies with us. And so Jürgen Moltmann, the theologian, wrote a book called The Crucified God. And in this book, he's talking about the way in which God comes amongst us there. So I think the cross is central to our understanding of God at work in history. Stephanie, what are 3 things that stood out to you in today's class?
I think it was interesting looking at the concept of the great man view and both the reasons why it's a good idea and why it's a bad idea to look at that. So how they're representing like the wide held beliefs of their context, but then also what are we missing when that's what we're looking at. So that was interesting to me. And then looking at like the validity of sources and the bias within that. So looking at the Hitler video, that sort of thing, and how we were saying that villains are like the heroes of their own story. So I guess looking at those different perspectives, and I guess the reasons why we kind of prefer one version over the other comes down to like our context and how that event has influenced us. And also just, I guess, just the idea that we do need to be critical in what we are looking at as history. So like the selective history that we often take as important, but then we're missing out on a whole bunch of different contexts and cultures and influences just because they're not, I guess, as relevant to our current society. So yeah, just interesting to think about what else we could consider as opposed to what we just usually would get in our context.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really good summary there. Ruben, what stood out to you?
Yeah, so I had that we have a Western grounded history or approach to history. And I liked the discussion about we need to be careful not to disregard other countries or other cultures' viewpoints. Then I had different perspectives of history. So with Victor's telling the story. So I've heard that in the past, but just reframing that in the whole discussion, I think was very helpful. And then also it was sort of on one of those passing off conversations. I think it was actually Maddie who said it, but recognizing students in class, and everyone needs to be recognized for doing their best. But we need to balance that with rewarding exceptional work. But the main focus should be that students are meeting their own individual goals.
Yeah, so good. So valuing individual goals. Madeline, your thoughts?
I actually had just a combination of what Steph and Ruben have said. So I had the representations of history are that they're representations of history when we read history, and they're going to be biased and need to be evaluated. And I think Steph did a great job touching on that, on a great man history idea. What Ruben said, winners write history, and that is the bias in that. And then I liked the thread, just as we were talking about, it just came up in pockets, but the changes in impact of Christian history, like even when Matilda was talking about the idea of how is the world better or worse, just from that Christian perspective, and then how that can be different to then the idea of major world events and major history, I guess how they're separate and how they're combined.
And Christian history is so interesting in that the building of hospitals, they used to be called hospitality places, and so the word hospitality, a hospital did much more. Christians have contributed a lot to that. University, first universities were part of a Roman Catholic development in Padua, Italy, in Paris, in Oxford, Cambridge. So Christians have contributed a lot to history, but at the same time, Christian leaders may do things that are not so good in history as well. And so in the Bible in Australia, Merrin Lake writes a book, Bible in Australia. Meredith Lake there describes the positive and challenging aspects of the Bible in Australia. Sometimes it's brought great benefit, and other times it's been used for not so good things. And so again, there is this thought on history can have benefits. Christian leadership can, but at other times there can be challenges. Noah, your thoughts briefly on what stood out today?
Yeah, I think Ruben said it quite well about the way that the different perspectives and stuff, and about the victors. And I also thought that the recognizing students doing their best was very similar to, I can't remember who quite said it, but it was in one of our other courses that was talking about students doing their best, as well as kind of encouraging them to push further. And I think that was really interesting. And then the first photo that you showed of Zulu and Napoleon, and how none of us knew really who Zulu was. I still don't know who he is. And I think that was a really good representation of kind of, yeah, how it is a lot of Western view, and whether that's because we as a society, as a Western society, have kind of been taught about what led us here specifically, or if it's because history has kind of been, for lack of a better word, whitewashed. I don't know, but yes, I think that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, that's well said. And Josiah, what stood out to you?
Somewhat already been said, but just the evident bias both in the writers of history and our interpretation. So a lot of like what we considered made the top 3 historical events affected were ones that affected us more personally and directly. So if you're a Christian, it's obvious that Jesus is going to be a very important historical event. If you're a woman, the right to vote, even the wars and giving women more opportunities within the workplace. So yeah, I found that rather interesting, seeing how our personal experience affected our interpretation.
Yeah, so good. Now, one big event in history was Martin Luther King's message to the people. And he preached a message at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York in 1956, in which it was titled The Death of Evil Upon the Seashore, based on the passage from Exodus, where the Israeli people left Egypt and the Egyptians pursued them. And one would have expected that when the Israeli people got trapped by the Dead Sea, then they would have been wiped out by the Egyptians. But the waters opened up, they passed through, and then the waters closed in, and there were dead Egyptians left scattered. And so the attacking evil people were left as dead. So it was a sermon titled The Death of Evil Upon the Seashore. And Martin Luther King says there's hardly anything more obvious than the fact of evil and its present in our world, in our lives, in the universe. We may debate the origin of evil, but we can't deny its reality. So in a sense, the whole of life is a history of the struggle between good and evil. And so often evil appears to triumph. James Russell Lowell wrote, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, yet the scaffold sways the future. And behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadow, keeping watch over his own." So, in a sense, evil is there and it often appears to be very powerful. But evil, says Martin Luther King, is ultimately doomed by the powerful insurgent forces of good and God. Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumphant beat of Easter and the resurrection. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross, but one day the same Christ will rise and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. So the death of Egyptians on the seashore is a glaring symbol of the ultimate doom of evil in its struggle with good. There's something in the very nature of the universe which is on the side of Israel in its struggle with Egypt, and on the side of good in its struggle with evil. What we're seeing now is a struggle, a gradual victory of forces of freedom and justice. There's a Red Sea in history that ultimately comes to carry the forces of goodness to the victory, opening up a way for good and closing in and bringing doom onto the forces of evil. Let us remember that as we struggle against Egypt, we must have love, compassion, understanding, and goodwill towards those against whom we struggle, helping them to realize that we seek to defeat the evils and not to defeat them personally. God has a great plan for this world. His purpose is to achieve a world where all men can live together as brothers, where every man recognizes the dignity and worth of human personality. So let's pray as we commit some of the lessons we've learned from history to God. And then if you've got any questions at all, ask. Otherwise, we'll conclude at that point. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your presence with us as we study, your presence with us in the life journey, your presence with us in the schools. We pray that you continue to help us to learn and to grow and to communicate a true and living and life-giving history that's true to your revelation to us, to others, through Scripture as well. Amen. So, any questions, speak now. Otherwise, next week we'll gather together again. And if you've made a start on assignment 2, then next week you could ask some questions about that. Next week we're looking at mathematics in particular, but also science a little bit, and the way in which that helps us to think critically for effective learning. So I'll see you all next week. Thank you, each one. And thanks for your great posts on your Zoom posts on the forums as well. Thank you.
Thank you.